Good afternoon. Why should Americans trust the church? Because the reality is that fewer and fewer people do. Now, this lack of trust doesn't affect only the church, of course. Poll after poll reveals the fact that people's trust in public institutions is eroding across the board. All of them. Banks, schools, businesses, police, the government, the media, you name it, we don't trust it. And it's getting worse and worse. We as Americans are becoming more and more cynical each time some new scandal emerges. Every time there's another story about abuse or misuse of power. Every time we see people more interested in promoting themselves or attacking other people. After a while, you just can't blame anyone if they decide they just want to crawl into a hole somewhere and never come out. Just let the world burn down around us. Leave me out of it. That seems to be the way more and more people are thinking, and can you blame them? If you don't trust the church, or if you don't trust institutional religion as a whole, you could see this as just one more example in the trend. But it doesn't have to be that way. Church does not have to be one more example of a public institution that people don't believe in anymore. Because as people's trust is falling down across the board, there is one interesting exception to this massive mistrust of everything. Americans still trust the military. And why is that? Why are we still willing to trust those who serve in uniform when we don't trust anyone else? Now, I'm not saying that the military can offer an answer for how the church can regain people's trust, but the abiding trust that people have in the military proves to us that a loss of trust isn't inevitable. Just because we're becoming more cynical overall doesn't mean that the church needs to be included in that cynicism. Now, let's be clear. The church does have plenty of faults. In recent years, probably the biggest black mark against the church are sex scandals, especially instances of pedophilia. And there's plenty of financial scandals to go around. People using religion to bilk other people out of their money so they can line their own profits. Then add to that the way some people use religion to justify whatever they want, and the picture is clear. There are plenty of scoundrels lurking in the house of God. Now, I can say that, and it could be very easy to get defensive. It could be easy to say, yeah, there's all these problems with the church, but let's think about all the good the church does for society. And to be honest, it would be easy to make that point as well. For example, in our county, services that address the needs of people who are less fortunate would collapse if it wasn't for the work of churches and of people of faith. The church really does do a lot to help our society and our country. You could argue that point. But the fact that you have to argue that point means you've already lost the debate. It should be obvious to everyone that the church is something good in our society. But it's not all that obvious. And you know what? Maybe it shouldn't be. Christians of all people should know that people can't be trusted. Our faith is predicated on the fact that people do terrible things, that we do terrible things. We don't have to point our finger at other people for being miserable and terrible and awful. Our faith is predicated on the fact that that's us. Our faith is a celebration of the fact that Jesus came to save us from ourselves. He saved us from ourselves because we needed saving. And just because Jesus saved us from our sin doesn't mean that we don't sin anymore. Now, we can see an awareness of humanity's sin, for example, in the way that we Presbyterians believe and the way that we do things. One element of classical Presbyterian or Reformed theology is called total depravity. Total depravity doesn't mean that we are completely, utterly evil with no good in us at all. Total depravity means that every aspect of human life has been tainted by sin. And this is why we begin each worship service the way we do. Every Sunday, as we enter into God's presence, one of the first things we do in worship is to confess our sin. We acknowledge that we are not worthy to be in God's presence. And then we celebrate. We are grateful for the fact that we have received his pardon. We see this also in Presbyterian church governance. It is structured around the awareness that everyone sins. And so therefore, we don't allow anyone to have too much authority, because we know if we do, no matter how good that person is, eventually they will misuse that authority. This is why, for example, I as a church pastor have very little authority over the church. Authority in our church rests in the session. And session members rotate off regularly so that none of them will have any authority for too long of a time. Perhaps the church has gotten into the mess it finds itself in because we forget this. We forget that we are sinful, broken people. Or we try to pretend that we aren't. We try to pretend that somehow we are immune to the corruption and abuse that is common to all of humanity. So maybe, just maybe, if we freely and publicly acknowledge that we as a church are broken, unreliable people, maybe that act of honesty will begin to earn just a tiny bit of respect. If we let people know that, yes, the church is full of screwed up people, and if you're willing to admit that you've made a mess of your life too, well, then we welcome you to join the club. Would you pray with me, please? Lord, as individuals and as a church, we confess that we have failed you, and we continue to fail you. You continue to ask us to be part of your work in this world, but we continually fall flat on our face. We're grateful, Lord, for your grace, for the way in which you set us free from our sin. But help us, Lord, to be honest about who we are. And may that honesty help others perhaps see if they can find a place in your home as well. Amen. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk again later.